Hello, and welcome to TSAM Daily. I'm delighted to be joined by Ronan Brennan, who is the Chief Product Officer for Compliance Solution Strategies, as well as John Lee, who is President for Compliance Solution Strategies. They're going to be having a chat today about moving from a tactical to a strategic approach for compliance.
Ronan, as a business and our business model, we always talk about that tactical to strategic journey that we undertake. Now, that obviously starts at the point of data. And you've got to look at the history of data and how the buy side has used data in the past, because they were very reliant upon third-party models for their entire data management infrastructure, and most of their technology infrastructure being handed down to them either by broker-dealers or custodians. Now, added to that, you had that balkanized technology that was in the front office as well, that they had to kind of grapple with, and all the different data feeds that would come into that and from that, and also other factors such as the mass, many proprietary formats they'd have from OMS providers. So data was a challenge. Data was seen as a heavy lift, but what we contend in that tactical to strategic journey that begins with data is that people need to change their mindset and view data as an asset and data as capital. So what does that actually mean to you, particularly when we talk about the regulatory book of record?
Yeah, so I guess what we've seen historically is that firms tend to respond not intentionally tactically, but observationally as they look back over history. They go, okay, there were a number of what are now apparently tactical decisions we've taken, and what that's led to is kind of a mishmash of technical integrations, a lot of overlapping integration with the same system, and at times ostensibly similar outputs. So if you were thinking and looking forward to what might happen next year, and we see, say, potentially looking at the UK and say a divergence between PRIPS and UCITS in the UK relative to the European space, you may observe firms that at the time will make a decision that they would see as strategic at that point in time, but could, say, down the line lead to a duplicate integration with different document vendors doing ostensibly something similar in the UK to something they may be doing similar in Europe. And in time, you'll end up with two firms integrating with your narrative management system, two firms integrating with your performance and risk platforms, two firms that are ostensibly producing documents. And they may have missed an opportunity to consolidate, not say just UCIT and KID document production, but also maybe to take a broader look at other documents that are being produced by the firms, such as their fact sheets and prospectus, but also taking a wider look at things coming down the track like ESG. So what were those firms planning doing with SFDR? So it's that ability to take a step back, observe the landscape with a much broader lens, or with your kind of wide angle lens, and look at all the different angles against which disclosures may be required going forward. And even then looking across the ocean into the United States and say, looking at what, as Chair Clayton is kind of just departing for the AG's office in New York, there's a new rule that's going to come into play with respect to shareholders or the fund shareholder disclosures that are required in the United States. And again, all of these could be looked at as one continuum. And if you were to look at global investment firms, a lot of this data is now being brought together into a single book of record. And our argument is that if you start to bring all your data together as a strategic asset in terms of what I would call your regulatory facing information, and manage that in a central location, it gives you that opportunity to leverage and use things way more efficiently as time moves forward.
I mean, I suppose a very good analogy for people to understand, it's very similar to the eyeball concept, which is that a centralized repository of verified data, which portfolio managers can use to make informed decisions. So in the same way, it's being able to make informed decisions about the use of data for your compliance requirements within a firm. And it always strikes me that there's certain regulations where, in terms of achieving efficiencies and cost efficiencies within the organization, that you have to look at the data commonality, the ability to repurpose data. Now, EMIR and SFTR, which you alluded to for repo securities lending, are just two such regulations, because if you actually look at the counterparty classifications are strikingly similar. The level of granularity that you need in the reporting, both through EMEA and SFTR, the mechanics of the reporting, and of course the collection of reference data for the instruments in scope within all of those. So again, having that centralized repository of data with the checkpoints so you can make informed decisions really gives you that. It doesn't just play into that requirement in terms of total cost of ownership and reducing your costs, but also it creates efficiency, scalability, and the control of risk. Is that something you'd agree with?
Yeah, and there's SFTR and EMEA are good examples. There's a common pattern there in the data as well as in the regulation. There's other ones as well. If you look in the hedge fund industry, we can see patterns emerge around, say, Annex 4 reporting, Form PF, CPR, PQR. In fact, I would describe that as the genus of the idea for our regulatory data model, which is kind of the foundation of our regulatory book of record, in which we would use what we call common asset tagging or a generic asset tagging concept to enable clients to deliver that data into our arbor once, and then from there we can do all of the different hedge fund reporting and ensure kind of complete consistency across the board. We also see similar opportunity around cost transparency. So, for example, in PRIPS, MiFID, defined contributions in the UK, indeed the cost transparency initiative in the UK, Dutch pensions, superannuation schemes in Australia, they all have a cost transparency regime, but in each case the nuances of the algorithm are different. But if you took a very strategic approach to that data in terms of how you managed and originally sourced it and drove kind of changes in the order management system to ensure the correct attributes were being captured and stored in your Arbor platform, you can serve all of those requirements from one single source of data, as we would do for some firms today already. So I think this is where people's mindset needs to be, is that as they look at regulations, they need to be looking for those patterns and exploiting them for future efficiency, or indeed working with a vendor that they know and trust is doing something very similar.
Right, and I think this is something we've applied in terms of our business to our the holistic fund reporting offering that we now have brought to the market, where it actually starts at the point of data ingestion with Arbor, the enrichment of that data and all the performance analytics that we can put around that, through to the template creation and exchange of those templates, or through to the document production and dissemination. And it's actually about having data at the backbone to that complete value chain that we bring to that offering.
Yeah, and again, it's in document production, where you are thinking about your prospectus, your fact sheet, your KIDs, your ESG disclosures as a continuum. And if you start to look at trying to build a consistent source of and a consistent operating model in the background for all document disclosure or document-led disclosure, then you can build a really hyper efficient operating model around that, and indeed then leverage that beyond that to do, for example, more dynamic web-based disclosures, publication of static data feeds into or static and dynamic data into market data vendors, or indeed the distribution platforms on which so many of our fund management companies are dependent for cross-border distribution. So this is where the real advantage comes into play, is when you start looking at data as a strategic asset, and in particular your regulator-facing information, then that's where the real return will come in the future.
And again, that whole issue of scalability, I think, at the top of this conversation, you mentioned a couple of regulations there, the PRIPS regulation and the transition from UCIT to PRIPS KID. But you also mentioned ESG, and I think it was Kay Swinburne who referred to the ESG regulation as being all-encompassing in a way, and the impact that will have on the delivery of those documents you mentioned, both within the fact sheets, within the KID documents. Yeah. That's going to have a huge impact, and to actually have already have a kind of embedded solution with a vendor who is controlling your data, who has cleansed that data, who's enriched that data for you, that meeting that requirement within ESG going forward could surely going to be simplified.
And we have obviously without the level 2, there's a lot of interpretation required in terms of how to respond initially at level 1. And having a vendor that understands the changes that are going to be required to your prospectus and to your fact sheets for those initial phases is going to be important. But even more so, having a vendor that has a good appreciation for the different directions that the level 2 may take as it emerges. We're guessing that it may be January 22 to align with the publication of the taxonomy. And
I think we've discussed this before. It's going to be incredibly demanding because it covers asset managers, insurance firms, pension product providers within that, and they're going to have to provide kind of disclosures, where they show they've really considered the sustainability risk in line with both the kind of the disclosure regulation that's coming from that's come out of the EU, and also the taxonomy regulation associated with that as well. I mean, it's a huge demand upon the industry.
Yeah, and indeed, classification of your products is going to be important. I would, a key takeaway that I'd have for firms looking at this over the next number of months is to take quite a risk-averse approach to classification of your products into what I call the dark green, light green, or not green at all buckets, because kind of downgrading a product from dark green Article 9 down to light green Article 8 could be seen as that one may have had a rap in their knuckles, that drove a downgrade of a product classification. So without knowledge of the strictness of the criteria, I'd definitely be saying to firms they need to understand the likely paths those criteria will take and the likely how strict might that be, and take a very risk and personally strict approach to your own classification until it does emerge. So I'd be certainly wary of classifying products 8 and 9 without having real confidence that they're going to pass muster. That classification will pass muster post level 2.
Right. I think just to kind of round off this brief conversation we've had, Ronan, when we talk about that progression from that, tactical requirements of meeting a specific regulation to that strategic approach to your compliance ecosystem within a firm, for want of a better description, that includes the data, it includes the enrichment of the data, it includes we were talking about fund reporting and the creation of templates and the document production and dissemination of those documents, but to actually have a strategic mindset and strategic approach. It used to be said that compliance was seen as something that did not create shareholder value. But there's another way to look at it, I think, and that is that it can impact the balance sheet, and ultimately it can impact upon your reputation. If you end up getting a lot of fines, the downside of not taking a holistic strategic approach can be very, very damaging. So can you actually see a scenario where the industry shifts towards a more strategic concept of compliance, so it actually becomes a competitive differentiator, your level of excellence, how you're rated on your compliance programs?
Yeah, indeed. I've heard it equated to the dirty window program that had been promoted in the US or in some US cities at some point in time. This inference that if the windows were dirty and broken, there was people made assumptions about the immediate area you were walking through, and the argument is made that for funds that poor representation of your external brand or having kind of negative regulatory news connected to your firm obviously could impact the potential flow of mandates of an investment dollar to your fund products. And without doubt, there has that corollary feels like it stands up to scrutiny. That there is certainly, if it's not an alpha contributor, it's definitely something that has a negative contribution if it doesn't pass muster initially. Yeah.
So in many ways, what you're saying, strategic compliance, it will become an indicator of competence and resilience and responsibility. Yeah. And in the age we're living in now, competence and resilience are very, very key attributes.
Exactly. Yeah. Without doubt.